The morning, in a sense, anticipated the afternoon. The morning was very much concerned with personal reflections of Robin as a teacher. This afternoon and into the evening have in a sense, three phases. The first is very much a kind of a presence of Robin in America, followed by some creative work that we feel is very much in sympathy with the kind of creativity that Robin demonstrated, followed into the evening, if I'm allowed to say, Kate, by something that Fred Scott calls an Irish wake. It's going to be a very gentle Irish wake, I'm told, Kate. But first to Robin in America, and we have three speakers. The very distinguished Spanish architect Rafael Moneo, who was chairman at Harvard while Robin was there. And I know from my brief engagements back and forward just how strong that relationship was and how much Robin meant to Harvard. Rafael will talk about that relationship and also about work that they have shared, a presentation essentially of a past presentation. Followed by Joe Connor's intellectual sparring partner, associate of Robin's, professor at Columbia, distinguished historian, who will talk on the idea of freedom in Baroque architecture. And lastly, Caroline Constant, a colleague of Robin's at Harvard for several years, who will talk about her recent work, in a sense, whose underlying nature draws from Robin's critical proposition, talk about Eileen Gray and her drawings. But first, let me ask you to welcome Rafael Moneo. Rafael.
Well, I want to thank Catherine Heron and to all of those responsible for today's celebration for inviting me to be here today. I very much wanted, and I am so impressed and so moved thinking in Robin, and I am very pleased to pay what I consider the very personal due tribute to him, a tribute that speaks about my admiration toward him, my respect, and my love. I can't say that I had this kind of intimate friendship, and yet he always has taken completely my sympathy, and as I am saying, my highest respect. Inevitable, these notes ought to be personal, and not to be personal because I want to remember, and thinking in Robin, the very first time that I read an article by him, and I think it was at the end of the 60s in an Italian magazine called Controspazio, and it was his article on the panopticon. Later, many more will come on the same subject, but that was for me in those days quite the discovery. Since then, I follow his work and I try to read whatever piece I have heard that has been published. And I always thought that, second to none, that nobody could be better teacher than him. And I very much, I was so pleased when he accepted to come to teach to the students at Harvard. It seems to me that it was refreshing, it was provocative, it was indeed crucial for the pedagogical structure of the school. To have somebody and to know somebody like Robin was a very substantial part of our curriculum. His condition of an architect allowed him to understand architecture much better than most of the critics and much better than most of the historians. I very much like it, just talking again and once more personally, I very much like it, his approach that always paid a lot of attention to issues that could be considered instrumental, and therefore his attention and his interest for drawing, his interest for just explaining how the way in which architects think and the procedures for expressing their own thoughts and the relationship with the construction methods are in the very bottom of a lot of architecture that at the end seems to be criticized or seems to be judged under quite different under quite different angles. It seems to me, being an architect, that Robin very much grasped some of those hidden corners, but crucial corners, that indeed those that work in architecture know to be the keystones for founding whatever architectural work. I think that his contribution, as I said, has been quite important for the school, and I know that to say that he will be always remembered is falling in a topic, but indeed I am sure that those students that went through Harvard during these last 8 years, or 6 years, or 7 years, they are going to be very, very much impressed by this British scholar that lived there and that was always giving them the best of his perception, very often illuminating aspects of the work that anybody else was going to do in such a perceptive, in such a deep way. I wanted to talk today mainly about the virtues of Robin, because I am talking about admiration, and indeed I admire what plainly can be said and openly his virtues. And his very first virtue for me was his independence. To be independent today is one of the highest targets for whoever life. To be able to think that you are doing what you actually and in the bottom of your soul want to do, without interfering, without being affected by trends, by those things that are fashionable, for those pressures that comes from the outside world. Forget about, let's say, circles of power, or forget about all the politics that accompany academic life, but just being intellectually independent is such a rare bird, it is such a rare condition today. I don't know too many scholars and too many critics and too many historians and too many architects that can't, for whom I would be able to use the label of independent. To be independent indeed is the most admirable, let's say, condition, or the most admirable attribute that whoever men and women could have. And indeed, Robin was an example of independence. I have known anybody so able to sustain himself in his own, I am not only to say beliefs, but in his own interest, in his own intellectual curiosity. And that is, at the same time, to be independent is the guarantee that you are saying something that is going to be interesting for the others, because walking in the same path than the others perhaps help to explore some ignored corner, but those that have the reward and the prize of being independent are those that indeed open new views, and those that indeed are able to offer something that anybody else know, and therefore to enrich the intellectual field of the intellectual life. Besides this independence, it seems to me that the other virtue, and probably many of those that have talked about Robin so in such a compelling way and in so eloquently this morning have insisted on that, but I don't regret to talk one more about that. And it's something that could be said as his rigor. He wanted to pursue it, what he was looking for, without saving any effort. That means that when something went into his own intellectual work that suddenly bring him in somewhere else. He never was lazy to go and to learn something that was required for extending more deeply the direction that he has taken. He indeed was always ready to look for the very end of the story. He never was satisfied with just finishing an article or just saying, well, I have already said something. He very much wanted, and he looked for and fight for just going until the very end and trying to establish at whatever cost the bridges that he thought should be established between, let's say, a drawing procedure and some kind of architecture, exploring history, exploring science, exploring the visual arts, exploring all those fields that could help him to achieve what he anticipated was going to happen, the hypothesis that he wanted to check. And therefore, he was so generous about his time. He never, that is also such a virtue in this world today, that you are not paying attention how much time you are putting in your own work, that you are not valuing in terms of hours or in terms of your own dedication what you are doing, that saying, well, I ought to do that well, and I ought to do that well, not, and now we will talk something about ethic and honesty, but I think that before that, it was this intellectual, high, very ambitious target of just reaching until the very end, and reaching without any idea of how was the value of time. That is indeed a very extraordinary, very exceptional condition in today's world. And that was together, and that is the third virtue. We say independence, rigor, intellectual rigor, and honesty. Honesty that was dedication, that was sincerity, that was, I have not known in the years of academic life somebody that was able to live so well, neglecting the physical condition, just trying to just like almost like a monk, thinking that what he needed to do was the essential thing, and don't paying attention for anything by that. The honesty of Robin was over whatever limit that you could think, and all these virtues together indeed have done of Robin an exceptional person in all our lives. I regret, and now comes the second part of my talk today, I regret immensely, and perhaps it was my respect that was translated into some shame and into being pudor. It is the Italian or the English word pudor, to be pudorous. Probably it was this sense of being pudorous that prevented to me to show him my work. I never talked with him about my work, and I regret it a lot, because indeed I very much would like to have talked with him about some words and have hear from him some advice and some comments and some opinions or judgment or whatever you want to say. But unfortunately, and perhaps because you never think about that somebody is going to disappear, I have thought sometimes, well, one day I should talk with Robin, and I should show him my work, and just trying to take this quite unbiased opinion that he has projected on my work. But as I said, times you were procrastinating this kind of encounters, and then death happened, and then is the moment when you regret that you didn't that. And therefore, today is for me the very moment in which I am going to show Robin what probably I had shown him before. And I have chosen this project very carefully. I have chosen the project that perhaps takes more of my effort or more of my time today. It's not yet under construction. If everything goes well, we'll start sometime next spring. But in this this is a project that very much would like to have commented and to have the talk with Robin about it. And therefore, by presenting to you, I want to think that I am presenting to him and having this opportunity of talking with him in a way that unfortunately didn't happen. Then we could start with this. Oh, sorry. Yes, okay. It's okay. Well, there is a project for, it's a auditorium or the convention center, let's say a public auditorium in San Sebastian. It was a competition in the spring of 1990. And then this project is very important for me because in a way or another it relates with issues that go from site to urban fabric, to methods, to materials, to most of the issues that indeed are affecting and are present in today's discussion as well as in my work. And this discussion obviously is present in your own work. The area where the new building should be built is here, in this corner. And then that was an extension of this. We consider to be one of the nicest Spanish cities. It's San Sebastián in the north of Spain. It is a beach and a bay, or let's say it's almost like a geography lesson, very tiny in scale, with hills, the end of the river, caves, beaches. It's almost this collection of all those geographical accidents. And then in the middle, the 19th century extension growing around a medieval city, and later less ordered also early 20th century extension. And here the building happened before. It was a small casino that was torn down in 1962-63, and since then this site has been waiting for something. And then it was in private hands, but in the crisis and in the years that came after Franco's death, the site was bought by the city hall, and the city hall was who opened the competition. And then the site, as I said, is a very beautiful site. The water is very important. Always this is a bit like the shoulder, like the rear of the city. Never has been so beautiful as at the other side of the city. Has been a bit of the rear facade, the back facade of the city, and always because it's very much punished by the water, by the wind, and by wind and water together. And here another couple of views of the site, just to keep you informed about the importance that for me has the geography. It seems to me that this is a project that I react against the conditions of the project, mainly thinking that we should overcome the idea of urban fabric and go into something that architecturally could relate with those geographical accidents, or something that indeed talk more explicitly to the geography that just to the fabric. And then the drawing there that shows what will be the solution. And then let me go more direct into the solution. And then the solution wants to say something, as I say, that indeed deliberately ignores whatever reference to the urban fabric. Most of the other competitors indeed try to do something that could be considered as an extension of that. I have built almost 20 years ago, between 18 years ago to be precise, a building here that indeed is incorporated and is embodied by this urban fabric. But reaching to this point, I very much like to keep this, let's say, natural light condition of the site than doing anything else. And therefore, I thought in these couple of buildings that are almost like glass rocks that are addressing each one to some of the mountains that are close to the end of the river, one to the Montulia, the other toward the Monturgur, and that they are almost like something like a fossil, something with the flavor of the geological attributes or features more than just those of the known urban fabric. And then the building works a bit like that. Once that I have accepted that, and those are issues that very much would like to have talked with Robin, for instance, why once that you have accepted that the project has been dictated from the outside, this is a sort of a shell that includes a rather quite well-known auditorium structure as well as the other, a bit different from some traditional ways of treating this subject, and yet using almost directly a well-established type. The foyer is this interstitial space that you see there. People moving from here, reaches to here, it will be some opening to allow you the view of the sea. And then in this platform, underneath, we will develop all those facilities that come together with this convention center, another music chamber, small hall, or something that would be used for some conventions, small conventions, an exhibition room there, and small offices for the organization that is going to run the entire complex. You realize that I was trying to avoid whatever relationship with the, let's say, curtain wall. I have talked about the idea of eyes. I very much wanted to be translucent, to give to the glass the condition of the solid, and then now we are entering into how the due treatment of the materials also affects and change the meaning and the understanding of the architecture. And indeed I am, as I said, quite intrigued with this project, and I very much would like to have had the opportunity of talking with Robbie. Here is that is from the competition, and it's an image of how we are cutting. You see the main hall, or something like the main hall, the stairs that bring you up into this opening toward the sea and the bay. It still was a very preliminary drawing. And here again another view that shows you more clearly this attempt to have this iced condition of these architectural pieces that has this tendency to relate, as I said, to the geographical accidents. And here again, just to keep you a bit more informed, we are not going to go through the entire project, but again, this image helps you to think about this architectural problem that the works and manipulates and beds for all those interstitial spaces between this that is going to be a translucent. You are not going to have any contact with the outside, but some small openings over there, and I hope they produce quite interesting spaces. But as you say, as you are able to see and to think, it works and it relates this well-known architectural type of quite well-known architectural object like the auditorium is related with the outside in a very, let's say, well, I don't want to use any adjective to say how it works, but it works in a way that doesn't relate so continuously as very often happens to be. For instance, I just finished the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection in Madrid, and that would be just the opposite like that. I mean, there is a project where the facade and the fabric of the walls is intimately related. Here, nothing of that happens, and therefore my interest in explore this new direction. And here, a section showing again the same set of problems and a more advanced plan where you are able to see how the pieces relate with the perimeter and how they relate among them, and you are able perhaps to foresee or to anticipate a bit of the spaces that will happen there. We will enter from the sidewalk, crossing the bridge, finding the large auditorium, the small one, going down into this convention meeting room or into the offices. And here the two last images that indeed speak clearly about what we are looking for. Unfortunately, both are inverted, but I think that reaching to this moment doesn't matter too much. I very much would like to have had the opportunity of having talked with Robin about this project, and by presenting you today, it seems to me that I have accomplished what had been my last wish. Thank you.
Okay, and can you focus? Okay, fine. Good. I'm Joseph Connors. I first met Robin in the old days of the AA in the early 80s, the AA of Alvin Boyarsky and Robin Middleton, as it meant to me and some of the other friends. He taught at Columbia in the mid-'80s, and I went to most of his classes then on the mathematical basis of architecture, especially Piero della Francesca and that sort of thing. Often you remember people by references they gave you, and he was the first person that told me I should read the Dictionary of Scientific Biography, most of it. He came to Columbia last November and lectured on a very different topic, Corbusier and the female body, a direction he was going in. But most of all, I remember him from a week in Rome in 1990 when he visited, when I was director of the American Academy in Rome. And we spent a lot of time walking, and in some senses our friendship was a friendship of the streets of New York at first, where neither of us were at home, I guess. The streets of London, where he was very much at home. I remember dragging two young sons, one of his and one of mine, to St. Paul's and the Wren churches, and having him tell me all sorts of interesting things about them. And then in Rome he said, "It's your turn." and he wanted to see the things that meant something to me. And this talk is to an attempt to reconstruct and at a bit synthesize the many walks of that week into one walk, and to say the kinds of ideas that he was so wonderful a person to bounce off of. I'd like to begin with two quotations or scenes from Baroque architecture. One is a famous phrase or paragraph written by the great Baroque architect Borromini. He says in the beginning of a book that he wrote but was later published in the 18th century, "I, for one, would never have entered this profession only to become a copyist, although I know that in inventing new things, the fruit of one's labor will come only late, just as it came late to Michelangelo himself, when in reforming the architecture of the great church of St. Peter's, he was pilloried for new forms and ornaments. I, for one, would never have entered this profession only to become a copyist," in many ways became Borromini's epitaph. Another scene, just the opposite, is an unfinished print by the painter Pietro Testa. It's to be a Mount Parnassus, in which many artists are showing younger artists how to carry on the profession, the craft, the art. And in the middle is Michelangelo, who tries to show a group of young architects how one can, as he puts it, enrich the mantle of architecture without offending Vitruvius and the ancients. But the lesson is a failure. Michelangelo becomes so upset with younger minds who go out and create monsters that in the end it seems better to leave lady architecture with her ancient dress, however worn and tattered, so that at least she can be seen in her noble proportions. In Testa's minds, young architects would do well to keep their distance from Michelangelo and all he stood for. Well, in those two vignettes, you see the exact opposite of a hunger for originality and creativity and a fear of it, that in a way are the polarities around which the century splits. Does this, well, okay, fine. Just to show you how some of these early Baroque designs took shape, a window of Michelangelo on the attic of St. Peter's, actually probably not by him, but thought by everyone in the 17th century to be by the master. A version that Maderno, Borromini's teacher, devised for his facade of the church, and you can see what's going on. That's to say, originality for this kind of mind is elaboration of decoration, increase in size, but especially a peppering of the simple motifs with extra ornament. But this, a generation later, is the way Borromini treats the same motif. A return to some extent to the basic simplicity, but an image that had been static is becoming dynamic. A window is learning to work its way free from the bondage of the wall. A larger image, the typical Counter-Reformation church facade, seen in a mid-16th century church, very simple, almost always larger on the bottom than on the top, and pediment on the top, and those volutes on either side that tie the narrow to the wider lower story. The way this is elaborated in the early Baroque, the Maderno period, where you have the same kind of facade, but again, greater and greater decoration and sculptural power, and also at this point embedding it in a larger context. Those two side wings, for instance, become background for the whole image. But then finally, again, the way this original mind, Borromini, would treat it. A facade in a place where it has no right to be, fronting a domestic building with a whole range of ordinary windows as well as a tiny chapel that is the justification for it. A facade which moves and tries to free itself dynamically from the wall. An image that's hard to read. In some ways, this is the facade. See the volutes and so forth. But an image that was so improbable, so creative, that it stumped people who viewed it, as we can tell from an early draftsman who sees the narrow curved part, or a later one who sees the whole building in a kind of literalistic way, or another person who thinks, well, it's the whole brick part of the building, until the architect returns to work 25 years after leaving the commission to write the way in which his buildings are viewed. And this is this wonderful way that drawings and prints can relate not only to the conception of a building, but to the reformation of that conception that Bob was so interested in. A drawing which mentally begins to reshape the facade, followed by prints. These only really have been, well, in any case, prints that seem to come out of that drawing, which shape it exactly as the architect wanted you to see it, unchained now from context and patronage, until finally the image sets in through prints into the gestalt of the Roman mind, and even down in the early days of photography. This is exactly where the edge of the lens of the Alinari brothers is set. My walks through Rome always, and especially the one with Bob, went to St. Ivo, and this is where we had our liveliest conversations. How was this unusual church made? For one thing, for all of its departure from precedent, its innovation, its incredibly organic, plastic, high-pressure forms, it is not without debt to Roman antiquity, as everything Borromini did. It's not loose, free-floating freedom, creativity, but it's freedom that's anchored in a very deep knowledge of the past. The drum, for instance, with those huge pilasters that press it in, seen rather nicely, I think, in this old unrestored photograph, I suppose, shining white now, and you get a bit less of the sense of dynamism. And the bulging curves of the drum that come outward again, like a sack of water under high pressure. If you look through drawings after the antique, something like Peruzzi's drawings, one finds sketches after these, what are called hexaconchs, these many apsed buildings, which is what Borromini uses as the basis for his drum. But if you imagine what the inside of that building would look like, you might think that walking in, you would find an interior like this. In fact, it's nothing like this at all. This is a Sicilian church of the 18th century, which is a wonderful version of the way a normal architect might have done the inside of St. Ivo if he had been doing it, but not Borromini, who does the inside of that hexaconch as a totally different geometrical form, a triangle with apses bulging out, not without precedent. We see his drawing for it here, this marvelous graphite and red chalk image with the bees in the center, the heraldic bees and so forth. And on a little scrap of thin paper, now in the Uffizi, but I think then in Rome, an early Peruzzi sketch that shows us him, this Renaissance architect, also experimenting with the same kind of idea. How does an architect create? In my feeling, there are two ideas at work here, the hexaconch and the star or the triangle with the apses, both of which are a bit erudite, but not totally out of the architect's culture of the 17th century. It's the synthesis of the two in ways that are completely unexpected. That is the lyric leap, the leap of brilliance that we can look at happening, but we can never really explain. If anybody were to build a cupola on this church, it would obviously be a little hexagon inside the building. Any centralized church has a cupola smaller than inside the building. But it's the stroke of genius to make the cupola larger than and outside the building. That only happens once in the history of architecture. You can really see them both there. The cupola bigger than and outside the building. That is maybe the best example of Borromini's freedom from, not from precedent completely, but from the way precedent can be used. Bob was an educator, and this is a university church, and I think he felt a special sympathy for it. We both dreamed of climbing it, but never quite could. We know how it would be done. The lantern has a stairway. What you have to do is sort of bend over backwards, get up here, walk around here, get into a little chamber, get out here, hold your breath, close your eyes, do 3.5 spirals until you get to a flaming crown on the top, where you go back in, and then you pull yourself up and out over the top. We know this was done. We even have a wonderful drawing from the late 17th century where a Frenchman, Oppenort, has shown us little people going into some of these cavities and eventually to wind their way around, go back inside, and pull themselves up out at the top. We both dreamed of doing it, I think, and this is one of these, I guess, forever unfulfilled wishes that we could do it together. The top of the church is this marvelous mixture of the triangular forms of part of the plan and the hexagonal forms of the other half, all coming into a certain unity at the very top, where if one could see the original church, you see the whole, there was a Holy Spirit on a rod about that long, about half this length. So in other words, the whole, and you can see it dropped after an earthquake, but nonetheless, it was a spirit that was really flying, a dove in the middle of the air. You can see that it's off-center. It was leading its cloud of glory rather than just in a static center. It was pulling the golden glory along with it. It was going to a church which was very crystalline, a floor which looked like a crystalline agglomerate. We know from the collections of the people who did it that they were fond of these cross-shaped stavrolite crystals. It told them that when nature played, it played in Christian ways. And I think this is built into the church. That's to say, a combination of what the 17th century would have called salt and spirit, crystalline, ruled, angular forms, salt, spirit, organic, free, rounder forms. Borromini lived on the Tiber, and after his suicide, the police came and took an inventory of the house. We know from the inventory exactly what was there, and a large part of the house could be described as what the Germans call a Wunderkammer, or a cabinet of curiosities. Through his material culture, we can get rather deep into the mind of the man, this miscellaneous collecting, but especially of natural objects. And here I think is maybe the key to the creativity of the person. The feeling that if one remained within the field, within the conventions of the discipline, a certain amount of originality could happen, but never profound and unexpected creativity. For that, one had to go outside of the discipline and look outside of architecture. And here I feel he went in two directions, and they can best be summarized under the headings of nature and the machine. Nature seen through 17th century eyes, collected in thousands of specimens and samples of these curiosity cabinets, and into the great museums of Rome, where ancient obelisks would be mixed together with crocodiles hanging from the ceiling, and barometers and scientific instruments mixed with telescopes and seashells. As Bob and I walked around Rome, his love of the markets, which will come up in a second. This is not a cat, it's a lynx, the sharp-eyed lynx of Galileo and his friends, who peered deep into the secrets of nature, who used the microscope, for instance, for the first time on the heraldic Barberini bee to see every hair and every facet of their 100-faceted eyes. It's the world that sees nature in mathematics everywhere, from the orbits of the planets to the whirls of a cauliflower. And I think it was this aspect, the mathematical world of the 17th century, that Bob and I found ourselves closest. The swirl of the shell, the geometry of nature, which comes out in architecture in restrained ways at first. This looks simply like a column with a base and capital, but as we read Borromini talking about it, we find him saying things like the extra little leaves at the bottom and the florid capital at the top make this look like a stalk coming into flower. There's a sense that the conventions of architecture are being transformed into something natural, growing, and organic. Nature, for one, and then the machine. Bob was so immersed in the modern world that I don't know if he, in any case, the idea that a machine age could have existed before the real machine age was a striking thing, that there are forms of tools which shape consciousness, just as tools shape consciousness in the 19th and 20th century, and of course in much more complicated ways. And one that came out was the lathe, the great machine on which bowls and balusters and pepper mills and piano legs and later and so forth are turned, which can be very simple operations such as this 17th century craftsman, or Leonardo's sketch of how one revises the machine so you have continuous motion, or a machine still found on the street of the Mediterranean, a Cairo turner turning out camel bone products on his lathe, or a shaker mill where a lathe would be used for furniture making. So one goes through any of these great collections, one sees furniture where the art of moldings is brought to an extreme of creative imagination. But beyond that, the people in Borromini's entourage who would picture themselves not holding compasses and architectural treatises, but holding these strange products, which at first look like toys, but one realizes eventually they're these incredible turning, pieces of ornamental turning, where you might have as much as 20 spheres of ivory, one all turned within another, like ships in a bottle, or stars of 15 or 20 points coming out of them. Incredible pieces of great, great patience and mathematical precision. It's an art which works its way into architecture. If one looks at Borromini's moldings and the geometrical basis of them, one comes very close to this world of the turner. A door frame of San Carlino, for instance, or a door frame with the oratory of the Filippini, where the undercut moldings look as though the image of turning on a lathe. But even more than that, the feeling of piled up and spiraling forms, free from the usual convention of the orders and the succession of the orders, like in the Colosseum and most Renaissance buildings, and instead a feeling that one could create these incredibly vibrant, ever-rising, imaginative forms one finds in the workshop and forms one finds in architecture as well. I think we ended our walk somewhere around one of Borromini's late churches, Sant'Andrea delle Frate, St. Andrew of the Hedges, which is half finished and half unfinished. The campanile shown there is the finished part. It goes up to a strange heraldic device on the top. And the drum, on the other hand, remains in its rude, rough brick, unfinished state. To get from the drawing, with its subtle superposition of geometrical layer after geometrical layer, to the building was something that absolutely fascinated Bob because of his interest in the relation of drawings and how difficult it is sometimes to get from them to final buildings. And here we have the final building, and it led us to talk a bit about construction and how things are built, and the interesting fact that these Baroque buildings went up with scaffolding, and that's why they're full of holes when they're unfinished, because this is where the scaffolding went, till they got to the very top, and then the scaffolding came out, and as it came out, layer by layer, the stucco, the ornament, was put on, with the horsehair and the metal holding it in place and so forth. So the raw body going up, and as they would say, the soul coming down. This particular church is unfinished. We have the body, but not the soul. To some extent with Bob it's different. We have not the body or the person, but in all those writings and all the memories we all have of him and the influence he had on us, we have to a large extent the soul. Thank you.
great honor to be here, and it's certainly a great honor to have been a friend of Bob Evans and of his wonderful family, who have hosted me on many occasions in this city. Bob and I talked frequently about our work, and when last I saw him in January, I said, well, I'll see you in London in May, and here I am talking to him once more. The last time I spoke at the AA, Bob and I were both lecturing on the Barcelona Pavilion, which was mentioned so often this morning. This talk is perhaps the beginning of a discussion that I think will be ongoing in my life with Bob. Lights. There we go. It's called A Non-Heroic Modernism, the Architecture of Eileen Gray. Although the various polemics that constitute the modern movement often achieve their primary architectural embodiment in private houses built for an intellectual elite, the House E1027 has been persistently overlooked in terms of its particular contribution to the modernist debate. The product of a collaboration between Eileen Gray, an Irish designer of lavish interiors and furnishings, and Jean Badavici, a Romanian architect and editor of the influential French periodical L'Architecture Vivante. It was completed in 1929 on a restricted site in Roquebrune overlooking the Mediterranean. Following its initial publication in Badavici's magazine, however, the house fell into relative obscurity, unmentioned in any histories of the modern movement. Gray herself articulated two principles that may account for this critical oversight: her dual resistance to theory and to the object qualities frequently associated with modernism. While these ideas may seem unrelated, each derives from man's need to assert control over his intellectual and physical environment. Both assume an attitude of detachment from any physical grounding in the experience of the world. For Eileen Gray, the house was not an object fixed in the gaze, but a flexible structure given life by its occupant. As she argued in a 1929 interview with Badavici, external architecture seems to have absorbed avant-garde architects at the expense of the interior, as if a house should be conceived for the pleasure of the eye more than for the well-being of its inhabitants. Transcending the marginal significance of the domestic interior, she brought it to the forefront of her concern to effect a critique of the spatial assumptions of modernism and its logocentric worldview. Gray, known in Paris during the teens and 20s as a designer of lacquered screens, furniture, and rugs, started to experiment directly with architectural design only in 1926, when she began collaborating with Badavici on the House E1027, whose name is a cipher for their intertwined initials. She based the design directly on Le Corbusier's 5 points of a new architecture: pilotis, roof garden, free plan, strip window, free facade. Rather than reflecting the limitations of Gray's atheoretical stance, this reliance on the ideas of Le Corbusier was a necessary corollary to her own critical act. Instead of posing an alternative narrative of mastery over the world, Gray sought a more compelling, comprehensive argument. By adopting and working within the framework of particular modernist spatial devices, she sought to transcend their limitations, and thus to reinstate within modernism its lost dimension, that of the human subject. Reacting against the formulaic aspects of modernism, Gray argued, formulas are nothing, life is everything, and life is simultaneously mind and heart. Rather than reject modern formulas, however, she sought to challenge their limits and push them to the point where they reestablished contact with life, to make some reality penetrate their abstraction. She accomplished this by conceiving of the house from the interior outward, from a reconsideration of modern man's need for an interior life and a place of retreat, a direction seemingly at odds with the modern postulates of transparency and spatial continuity. To convey her intentions, Gray resuscitated an 18th century drawing technique representing a room as 4 sectional elevations folded out from the plan. Architects of the style group originally revived this type of drawing as part of their renewed emphasis on domestic interiors. As Bob Evans has shown, it articulates the principle of a total concept of design, wherein wall and window, furnishings, floor, and carpeting contribute equally to the creation of a microcosm, a complete and private milieu. It underscores Gray's conception of the furniture as a series of extrusions from the wall, stressing the interdependence of the elements and their imperviousness to reduction as independent objects. Her fascination, and this is the room depicted in that drawing, her fascination with opacity and indecipherability led Gray to focus on the surface of these fittings, their colors, textures, and reflective qualities, rather than their profile, modeling, or placement in a legible space. She subordinated the object qualities of her furnishings to the ambiance of the spatial sequence, which she directed toward enhancing experiential qualities as lived and felt, rather than conceptualized. The individual element is never isolated and made to represent the totality of the ensemble. The visible is supported and interpenetrated by what is out of sight. The layering of her forms, such that one thing seemingly merges into another, recalls Walter Benjamin's assertion that the traditional interior was not just the universe of the private citizen, but also his protective casing. In place of the sentimental objects of the bourgeois interior, Gray posited a combination of architecture and furniture to perform a protected place of ideological and affective identification. Yet she accomplished this without sacrificing the transparent possibilities of the modern. The window manifests the potential for these apparently divergent conditions to coexist. The strip window was a primary element in Le Corbusier's domestic ensemble. It was part of his strategy for putting the traditional habitation in a critical position, not only with regard to form, but also to its use and significance. In contrast to Le Corbusier's sharp delineation of the strip window, Gray articulated hers as a layered membrane. Its outer zone of sliding shutters with horizontally pivoting louvers contributes to the privacy of the interior while controlling outward views, penetration of the sun's rays, and ventilation. At the same time, its vertical panes of glass are analogous to the human body, suggesting that it is possible to embrace modernism without suffering the loss of anthropomorphic reference inherent in traditional windows. These panes and the doors opening onto the terrace pivot and slide, much like draperies, to facilitate an uninterrupted expanse. The interior can thus open directly to garden and sea. I think you can see that particularly in the image on the left. Auguste Perret saw the strip window as a transgression of values deeply rooted in the culture and life of the interior. In a well-known dispute with Le Corbusier, Perret argued, "The horizontal window is not a window is a man." To Pierre Jeanneret's assertion that the eye looks horizontally, he retorted, "I detest panoramas." Gray's strip window merges two seemingly disparate objectives, opening the dark and private recesses of the traditional interior to the purview of the outer world, while affording the body a sense of protection. It addresses body and panorama simultaneously, affording a new freedom of choice. She could thus fulfill the premise of the modern dwelling as a volume reaching for light, while preserving the sanctity of the private life of the interior by rendering its degree of exposure to the outer world a matter of choice. While acting as a site of liberation, Gray's interior provides a concomitant sense of anchorage through its reaffirmation of the humanist subject. She extended her critique of Corbusian principles to issues of technology and modernism. While Le Corbusier's theory of the house as a machine à habiter derives from ideas of mass production, he relied on appropriating aesthetic images of machines rather than processes of mechanical reproduction. Gray used machine imagery to different ends. She was inspired by the efficiency of nautical forms, their embodiment of minimalism in service to the human body. Thus, taut sailcloth membranes supported on the porch's metal railings afford seasonal protection from the sun, while deck chairs expose the body to its warming rays. Built-in headboards enveloping her beds house storage for cushions, books, and a hot water bottle, while supporting reading lights, electric outlets, and switches, and an extending tabletop, all in service to the supine figure. In his 1925 editorial description of the Schroeder House, Bottavici noted a similar source of inspiration, no doubt influential for E1027 than in its early planning stages. Bottavici argued, "The composition of the interiors can be modified according to need by means of sliding partitions, and the furnishings, reduced to the essential, take their inspiration from the cars of the wagon lit." Gray transcended such functional and symbolic appropriation of technological imagery, however, by embedding it within her more phenomenological approach. Such a concept of total design usually results in the imposition of an architectural will on the occupant. In contrast to the work of Gerrit Rietveld and Truus Schroeder, or that of Le Corbusier, Gray's sense of design derives from the enabling powers of architecture vis-a-vis the human body. She rendered the subject an active agent in her environment, forcefully shaping the space that receives her, more a participant than a mere occupant. Movement is essential to this idea, particularly in the reciprocity between an active body and a field of experience. Gray's concept of choreography, conveyed evocatively in her site drawings for E1027, bears comparison with Le Corbusier's concept of the promenade architecturale. Rather than an iterative means of achieving mastery over the world, dependent on a succession of objective goals revealed to the moving spectator, which was inherently picturesque, she fostered the occupant's sense of immersion in a sequence of experiences. As the French psychologist Lucy Irigaray has noted, more than the other senses, the eye objectifies and masters. It sets at a distance, maintains the distance. In our culture, the predominance of the look over smell, taste, touch, hearing has brought about an impoverishment of bodily relations. The moment the look dominates, the body loses its materiality. Gray manipulated vision to different ends, intertwining the visible with what is out of sight. In notes she later wrote on entering a house, for example, she commented on the desire to penetrate a transition which still keeps the mystery of the object one is going to see, which keeps the pleasure in suspense. Le Corbusier's suggestion that she remove this divider, which blocks the entry view of the main salon, is a revealing indicator of their difference. Gray sought to transcend the reductive essence of the gaze. By calling upon the imagination to draw one into the experience, her architecture reawakens the unconscious and has commerce with the whole human body. For Gray, as for Maurice Merleau-Ponty, embodied vision, the reversible chiasmatic intertwining of the visible and invisible, the viewer and the viewed, in the flesh of the world, could be the locus of positive meaning. Similarly, the logic of Le Corbusier's modulor as a means to address the measure of man contrasts with Gray's methods, which lack the quality of an imposed order derived from logic, and instead originate from the modern notion of the experienced body. For example, Gray's column spacing derives from internal spatial priorities rather than from numerical notions of order. It is widest at the center of the main salon, where she provided for the greatest flexibility of use and maximum exposure to the out of doors, whereas the narrower bays to either side accommodate more intimate spaces for dining and sleeping. On the lower level, moreover, she shifted the position of one column relative to that above to shield the maid's window from view. You can see that. Such a modern return of the body, with its dream of meaning-laden imprecation of the viewer and the viewed in the flesh of the world, challenges the Cartesian privileging of internal vision at the cost of the actual senses. She invoked the senses directly and indirectly in her forms. The warmth of the tile flooring underfoot that radiates heat from the sun, an invocation of the oral in the cork tea table that muffles sound. Where Le Corbusier used curve forms to represent contact with the body, in the bath of the Villa Savoie, for example, Gray relied on choice of materials to express degrees of bodily contact, from chromium handrails to fur bed throws. Furthermore, her furniture invokes analogies with the mechanics of the body, in the flexibility of the table that extends to meet the occupant of the bed, the drawers that pivot horizontally, or the closet that expands in breadth to facilitate access, for example. As Elaine Scarry notes, the subject's bodily consciousness is augmented by the object's visual disintegration. Quote, if the objects in the external field begin to appear distorted or blurred, she will cease to experience vision only as objectified interior content, and will begin to become more self-conscious of the event of seeing itself. She no longer experiences the images of objects without also experiencing her own body. And I remember that Bob made a similar argument about Nice in the Barcelona Pavilion. In those areas of the house where contact with the body is most intimate, the bedroom and bathroom, Gray strove to heighten bodily awareness. The profusion of reflective surfaces in the bathrooms, for instance, includes tiled walls, folding mirrors, porcelain sinks, and a polished aluminum tub enclosure. Such material palpability invokes a sense of the erotic. The house is marked by the experience of a sexed body. The poverty of modern architecture, she wrote during the 1940s in a direct affront to Le Corbusier, stems from the atrophy of sensuality. Everything is dominated by reason in order to create amazement without proper research. The art of the engineer is not enough if it is not guided by the primitive needs of men. Reason without instinct. We must mistrust merely pictorial elements if they are not assimilated by instinct. Gray viewed the dwelling as a living organism in which each of the inhabitants could, if need be, find total independence and an atmosphere of solitude and concentration. Her critique extends beyond the dictates of modernism. It aims at no less than challenging the homocentric worldview postulated by Cartesian rationalism. While resisting the lure of architectural theory, theory is not sufficient for life and does not answer to all its requirements, she argued. Gray recognized the need to transcend the intuitive limits of her work and ground it in the intellect, in a fertile combination of the sensual and the commonsensical. Her atheoretical stance is directly tied to her critique of the object. As Craig Owens acknowledges, it is not always theory per se that women repudiate, nor simply the priority men have granted to it, its rigid opposition to practical experience. Rather, what they challenge is the distance it maintains between itself and its object, a distance which objectifies and masters. For Gray, theory is embedded in the work. Our failure to recognize her work as theoretical merely indicates a disinclination to examine any work of architecture unaided by the crutch of external theory. It is hoped that these remarks will not only contribute to a deeper appreciation of the critical intentions behind Eileen Gray's work, but also broaden the scope of current architectural discourse. Much like the imaginary country that Charles Baudelaire summons in his prose poem L'Invitation au Voyage of 1869, a possible inspiration for Gray's mural in the E1027 Salon. One could say of her architecture, it is there that we must go to breathe, to dream, and to prolong the hours in an infinity of sensations. The spirit of her architecture draws further inspiration from Baudelaire. All the furniture is armed with locks and secrets, like all civilized souls. Mirrors, metals, fabrics, pottery, and works of the goldsmith's art play a symphony for the eye. And every corner, every crack, every drawer, and curtain's fold breathes forth a curious perfume, a perfume of Sumatra, whispering, "Come back," which is the soul of the abode. Thank you.
As I think Kate has said, James Tyrrell is not able to come to be here today. We decided that, in fact, I will read a short passage from a paper by Robin entitled Translations from Drawing to Building, which was published in the AA Files, and which has set above it a picture by Jasper Johns called The Critic Sees, in which, as you may recall, there is a pair of spectacles of the critic behind there where the eyes would be teeth. To translate is to convey. It is to move something without altering it. This is its original meaning, and this is what happens in translatory motion. Such, too, by analogy with translatory motion, the translation of languages. Yet the substratum across which the sense of words is translated from language to language does not appear to have the requisite evenness and continuity. Things can get bent, broken, or lost on the way. The assumption that there is a uniform space through which meaning may glide without modulation is more than just a naive delusion, however. Only by assuming its pure and unconditional existence in the first place can any precise knowledge of the pattern of deviations from this imaginary condition be gained. I would like to suggest that something similar occurs in architecture between the drawing and the building, and that a similar suspension of critical disbelief is necessary in order to enable architects to perform their task at all. I would like to suggest also that while such an enabling fiction may be made explicit, this has not been done in architecture, and that because of this inexplicitness, a curious situation has come to pass, in which, while on the one hand the drawing might be vastly overvalued, on the other hand the properties of drawing, its peculiar powers in relation to its putative subject, the building, are hardly recognized at all. Recognition of the drawing's power as a medium turns out, unexpectedly, to be the recognition of the drawing's distinctness from and unlikeness to the thing that is represented, rather than its likeness to it, which is neither as paradoxical nor as dissociative as it may seem. Before embarking on the investigation of drawing's role in architecture, a few more words might be spent on language, more particularly on the common antilogy that would have architecture be like language, but also independent of it. All things with conceptual dimension are like language, as all grey things are like elephants. A great deal in architecture may be language-like, without being language. Some might say that the recent insistence that architecture is a language is only the last wave of a persistent verbal tide eroding vision, bedeviling our ability to see without language, to guide our eyes. In the words of the poet Paul Balaguer, used as the title of a recent biography of an American artist, seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. Can we really be certain? Might not this purism be in danger of becoming a ridiculous piety? Having recognized that words affect vision, we're under no moral obligation to expel them from it, even if the expulsion could be achieved. It is understandable that in the interest of the integrity of our art, we should imagine it contaminated by other forms of communication, just as it is understandable that in the interests of its aggrandizement, we should imagine it comparable to language. But this is only to offer excuses for the possession of incompatible ideas. Fastidiousness about the purity of vision arises from a fear that all distinction will be lost as one category forces itself into another. We protect it because we think it in danger of being overwhelmed by a more powerful agency. With our minds fixed on the predominance of language, we might even risk enclosing architecture within its own compound, denying it communication with anything else to preserve its integrity. This would be possible, yet it seems very unlikely to occur because for architecture, even in the solitude of pretended autonomy, there is one unfailing communicant, and that is the drawing. Some English art historians have been directing attention to the transactions between language and the visual arts. Michael Baxendale with the early Italian humanists, Tim Clark with French 19th century painting, and Norman Bryson with 17th and 18th century French painting. Their studies which have advanced art history into an area never properly examined, show painters and commentators trying to extricate painting from language, or trying to accommodate to it, in what was not so much a war between the verbal and the visible as an economy between them. Full of friction, though the deals back and forth may have been, I found their work invaluable and stimulating. It seems to me, however, that this economy, dominated by the trade between two powers, cannot be transferred to the study of architecture without adaptation. For the architectural drawing constitutes a third force that may well be equal to those of the artwork and its commentaries. My own suspicion of the enormous generative part played by architectural drawing stems from a brief period of teaching in an art college. Bringing with me the conviction that architecture and the visual arts are closely allied, I was soon struck, at the time, by the particular and peculiar disadvantage under which architects labour, never working directly with the object of their thought, always working at it through some intervening medium, almost always the drawing. While painters and sculptors, who might spend some time on preliminary sketches and maquette, all ended up working on the thing itself, which naturally absorbed most of their attention and effort. I still cannot understand, in retrospect, why the implications of this simple observation had never been brought home to me before. The sketch and maquette are much closer to painting and sculpture than a drawing is to a building. And the process of development, the formulation, is rarely brought to a conclusion within these preliminary studies. Nearly always the most intense activity is the construction and manipulation of the final artifact. The purpose of preliminary studies being to give a sufficient definition for final work to begin, not to provide a complete determination in advance, as in architectural drawing. The resulting displacement of effort and indirectness of access still seems to me a distinguishing feature of conventional architecture, considered as a visual art. But whether always and necessarily disadvantageous is another question. Two divergent definitions of the possibilities for architecture follow from the recognition of this displacement. We may choose to join architecture to the other visual arts more securely by insisting only that which the architect manipulates with his own hands is his work. It is also too clear that this new intimacy would first require a divorce, because as we gained more direct access to the work, we would be relinquishing claim to the architecture that now flourishes within the political, economic, and social order. If architecture were redefined in this way, it might become more scrupulous and less responsible, smaller and less predictable, worth less but better, as the hope would be. Would it not that in giving up grandiose pretensions to represent and define the social world in both its imaginative and active aspects, a project the unlikelihood of which is comparable to the unlikelihood of compiling a legal code that is also a good novel, an ambition that can only be confounded in practice. Architecture may, by contraction and concentration, constitute itself anew. Well, this consolidation through withdrawal is already underway. And the problem is that it has become exactly this: a consolidation, a restoration, a simple relocation of investment within the region staked out long ago as belonging to architecture. What might have occurred in architecture, but did not, occurred outside it, and indeed outside painting and sculpture, insofar as these are categorically defined. To insist on direct access to the work may only be to designate the drawing as the real repository of architectural art. It may also be to reject drawing out of hand. Of the works beyond the pale of architecture, earth art, performance, installations, constructions, which nevertheless deal with recognizably architectural themes, several are remarkable, not just for the fact that they make little or no use of drawing, but for the impossibility of their development through this medium. The work of the Los Angeles artist James Turrell may be used as an instance. The mainstay of Turrell's work through the late 60s and 70s was the artificially lit room. Most architectural of these were a series of empty spaces, which, if drawn up within current architectural conventions, could only be construed as indicative of witless simplicity. Their effect as installations can nonetheless be completely overwhelming. Such directly apprehensible qualities as they possess have nothing to do with the presence of the artist's hands, feelings, or personality. Fabricated as they are, with tremendous precision and parsimony, there is no more trace of Turrell in these rooms than of Mies in the most sparse of Miesian interiors. Evoking gushes of transcendental mystification from some critics, Turrell has to do with observers not being able to believe their own eyes. You look into something which you know is another rectangular room through which you peer. You can see how it works. You can put your hands into it. You can even see, standing out against the haze of illumination that moves from mauve through to pink, evidence of some earlier instigator who took it into his head to climb into the illusion, leaving his footprints in the otherwise spotless, spaceless interior. Even then, only by deduction can you maintain either the depth of the room or the emptiness of it. For the light looks, if not solid, then incredibly dense, as if its luminosity would not so much reveal the image of anything thrust into it as devour it. Take a few steps back, and it is impossible to envisage its depth, even by an act of conscious will. A few more, and the screen-like aperture through which you looked seems to be standing out of a block of light in blatant contradiction of all you know to be true. The most remarkable properties of Turrell's installations are local and not transportable, the result of direct observation of the play of electric light on white painted surfaces and countless experiments in situ. They cannot be adequately illustrated or photographed after their construction, and there is no way that even the vaguest hint of their effect could have originated through drawing. We agreed now that we would break for half an hour before continuing the afternoon.